Despite the various cooperation agreements signed between the Soviet and American leaders, the invisible forces of the KGB and the CIA continued gathering information. The Cold War was still in the news, and these exchanges were particularly monitored. For Seymour Liebergut, radio operator in the control room, this trip to the USSR was a chance to see behind the curtain.
The Russians were very paranoid about security. And as a matter of fact, I was warned by Bob Overmeyer, one of our astronauts that stayed over there during the mission. Bob said, the Hotel Rosia has 3,000 rooms. He says you have to get used to the fact that all of them are bugged. They all have eavesdropping. And if you need clean sheets or a towel, open the doors on the armoire and say, "I need more towels," and they'll be there the next morning. And we saw all that. We saw the short men with the long coats and fedora hats that followed us around over there. It's for our protection, of course, right?
Everyone wanted to know how sincere the other side was. Everyone wanted to know if, by chance, the other side wasn't doing all this for espionage reasons rather than political rapprochement.
At the time, the Russians were extremely handicapped in the field of information technology in particular, as in the field of electronics. So one thing the Americans guarded jealously was that the Russians, at the time the Soviets, should not profit from any unwitting technology transfers.
As you can imagine, the Russians were briefed by the KGB and the Americans by the CIA before the mission. Each had to know what should be talked about and what should not.
I'd like to introduce to you our honored guests this evening. We've all read.
And we watch these young men, these representatives of us, from two cultures, as they learn to work together.
Gray matter was not enough to ensure the success of such a mission. Each astronaut had to prepare like an athlete, even if they were only part of the backup crew, like Vladimir Zhanibekov. Age 32, he was at the beginning of a very long career as a cosmonaut.
The first time we arrived at NASA, there was a sign saying, "Beware, the Russians are coming." Right next to me, the door was open. There was a blackboard on which someone had drawn a space shuttle. And from its hold, bombs were falling onto a map of Russia. We laughed, of course, but the memory stayed with me.
1 year before the start of the mission, the two crews gathered in Houston where they trained on mock-ups and simulators. Together, they would have to draw up a precise mission schedule.
Then the question arose of where the two crews should meet. How many dockings? Who goes first? We all fought to be first. Konstantin Bushriev, who had diplomatic training, convinced the Americans, with his characteristic gentle insistence, that the Soviet Union should leave first.
Finally, after long negotiations, it was decided that on July 15, 1975, the Soyuz rocket would take off first and ignite the media interest, one of the main objectives of this mission. And the teams on the ground certainly got the picture. For the first time, the American Apollo spacecraft would carry 4 state-of-the-art portable video cameras and a VCR recorder.
You know, I pioneered color TV on Apollo 10. I won an Emmy. And so it was TV had become a very important just to share with the public because they're the taxpayers, they pay for it. I pushed for all the TV we could get because we wanted to show the rest of the world what we were doing.
In the case of the Soyuz, it was the first publicly live televised launch of a spacecraft. Everything had been kept and embargoed until they were certain that they were successful. So it was very important to the Soviet people as well as to the world.
By 1974, NASA had lost its luster. Manned space flights no longer fired the crowd's imagination, and part of American public opinion held that these flights were no longer useful and cost too much. So the National Aeronautics and Space Administration were keen to make an impression with Apollo Soyuz. The keynote image of this mission would be the handshake between Alexey Leonov and Thomas Stafford. However hearty the handshake, it would cost NASA the equivalent of $1 billion of today's dollars.
They practiced that handshake 1,000 times. They rehearsed with models. They also worked on their speeches to have at least a base to work from. But what do you want? It's all a bit like theater. Okay. Я думаю, that score я проваю look 3. How are you, Alexey?
I'm well. Glad to see you.
There were lots of debates. In the end, it was agreed that the meeting should take place between the airlock and the Soyuz service compartment. The staging was rather artificial. It was cramped and difficult to film in that spot. Impossible to get interesting shots for television. We wouldn't get beautiful pictures. We had to film at an angle so as not to distort the image.
Well, the handshake was very important because that was the symbolic meeting in space. The handshake is a universal gesture of comradeship and openship, revealing that you are unarmed. You're holding out your hand in greeting.
When the Soviet crew would be in the United States, all different crew members would have them to their house for dinner, and the engineers too. All that, so we developed a very close relationship.
In the United States, I want to visit Hollywood.
Alexey Leonov, Soyuz commander.
Because I want to be a movie star.
Colonel in the Soviet Air Force.
No, I don't want. Tom Stafford want.
Leonov and Stafford built a very tight relationship. It was actually because Leonov is a very personable person, a guy that has a real personality. He likes to laugh. He likes to do things that he never seen. He likes to test you. And Stafford was more an upright guy. But Leonov's attitude kind of broke his tough spirit and made him more human.
The two commanders will be flying two very different vessels. The Apollo craft was developed for lunar missions, so Apollo had extensive maneuverability and great flight autonomy. The astronauts could live in it for almost 30 days in total autonomy. Soyuz was less sophisticated than Apollo, and its smaller fuel storage capacity prevented it from flying at altitudes higher than 1,300 kilometers. But Soyuz had already demonstrated that its automatic docking system worked when handling hookups in space. Today, the Russian module has become a taxicab for the International Space Station.
Американские и советские специалисты приступили к изучению аспектов космического эксперимента, обмену научной информацией. Они обеспечили друг другу доступ ко всем необходимым техническим данным, по системам управления, стабилизации, совместимым средствам сближения, стыковки и радиосвязи обоих типов кораблей.
The Russian and American teams would therefore have to construct a junction between the modules.
This simple thing masked a terrible wrangle. Who would be the male and who the female? And neither one side nor the other wanted to be the female.
The earlier systems involved having a device that was a kind of a probe. In our language, we would call that a male part that would then engage what is a female part. So our designers were interested in trying to come up with something that would work equally well. So we got to the point where we captured the two vehicles with a system that was identical on both sides. It had these interlocking fingers that brought the vehicle together.
The docking system developed for the Apollo Soyuz mission comprised 3 petals used as a guide atop a docking collar. The collar absorbed any impacts between the 2 vessels, after which it would retract and maintain an interlock between Soyuz and Apollo. A competition was held between the 2 nations, and the Russian Tulip model was selected. However, each country would build it using its own methods.
Okay, Houston, this is Soyuz. We are ready for joint work.
Soyuz, Apollo, сейчас начинаю ориентацию.
2 years on, their efforts had borne fruit, as the atmosphere between the 2 crews was looking good. Away from the pressures of their administrations, freed from the weight of hierarchy, far removed from the worries of the world outside, astronauts and cosmonauts of the Apollo Soyuz mission readily shared precise information between themselves, even drawing on each other's methodology.
I'll give you an example of what we learned working with the Americans. They would establish their technical documentation about the stages of the flight in detail. We would set the broad strokes and then fill in the details during the flight. They would describe every unexpected contingency that they dreamt up on Earth. Books this thick. And we learned that for serious flights, the more in-depth method was indeed better. That's what they taught us. Were we tolerant, intolerant? We just had a professional relationship between people who could understand each other technically and intellectually. That's it. If only that was the case with everyone on Earth.
So by the time we flew, and I developed this relationship with Alexey. Sometimes even NASA and they quote their Academy of Science, that's where it was carried on. We'd disagree. We'd say, hey, we'll work it out together, don't worry about it.
Two months before blastoff, physical preparations were stepped up and flight chronology formalized.
To my right, you can see command device signal. Command device signal.
Because in space, there is no room for improvisation. Crews revised their flight plans ceaselessly, over and over, fine-tuning the various procedures down to the last second. Everything is validated and then recorded. The 2 crews were ready for takeoff. But one problem remained. In 2 years, the Americans were never able to work with the real Soyuz.
And finally I said, look, I need to see the real spacecraft. They said, oh no, the real spacecraft is now down at Baikonur. Nobody has ever been there. No, right, can't go there. I said, wait a minute. I have flown nearly 100 different types of aircraft. I have flown 3 different types of spacecraft. And I have yet to see a simulator or a mock-up that is exactly like the real plane. So either I take my crew there and do it, or we don't fly. And the Soviet management says, oh, they didn't know what to think. And one of them said, we'll send in the backup crew. And Alan Bean said, you don't understand. If Stafford doesn't fly, I don't fly. It was called the Astronaut Union, had a strike.
In the end, with the cosmonauts' support, Thomas Stafford and his team's request was granted. On April 28, 1975, they were the first Americans to visit the ultra-secret launch site of Baikonur in Kazakhstan. The crews could finally take off.